This episode contains graphic depictions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. By 9 p.m., Emma Lou Sharp was getting worried. 20-year-old Emma Lou was a black woman who lived with her mother in a humble home on the east side of Atlanta. It's July the 1st, 1911. Earlier that night, Emma Lou's mother, Lena, had left the house telling her daughter that she was going to make a quick trip to the market. After about an hour, Emma Lou starts to get worried, and for good reason. Rumors of a killer who preferred black women as his victims had been swirling for months in Atlanta's black community. It's July, so it would have been a warm, humid summer night when Emma Lou heads out into the streets in search of her mom. The trees above her are filled with buzzing cicadas as she walks down the secluded Hanover Street. Her family lived on Hanover, a street in East Atlanta nestled against the city's mighty Seaboard rail line. It's a dark night, and Emma Lou isn't getting any help from street lamps. They don't exist in this part of Atlanta, so it's likely she's carrying a small lantern as she begins her one-woman search. With each step into the night, she grows more uneasy. She's heard the story of Addie Watts being killed just a few weeks earlier, not too far from where she and her mother lived. As she approaches the simple wood-framed mercantile store her mother had set out for, she desperately hopes to find her inside. This place, it's not new to her. She's walked the dirt floor aisles many times as a little girl, holding her mother's hand as she shopped for weekly groceries. Emma Lou pushes open the creaking door, looking past the freshly butchered meat hanging from the ceiling and neatly kept rows of vegetables. She pans her eyes left, then right, straining, hoping. No sign of her mother. She turns towards the counter to get the attention of the store clerk, asking if they'd seen her mother come in earlier that evening. The clerk shakes her head. As Emma Lou turns to leave the market, her worry grows and her pace quickens as she steps back out into the night. Not finding her mother along the walking route to the store and not finding her at the store, Emma Lou begins walking back in the direction of their home on Hanover Street. Surely her mother has arrived while she was away. With lantern in hand, she walks quickly but silently. Her mind races with worry, conjuring a new nightmarish vision with every step. Suddenly, a shadow emerges from the darkness. A towering human form slides in front of her, blocking her path. She stops in her tracks and her heart lurches. She takes a step back, raising her lantern to illuminate the imposing figure. The flicker of the flame casts a mottled orange glow on the face of a well-built black man. He is tall, his shoulders broad and muscular. On his head is a hat as black as the night and with a wide brim that partially covers his eyes. He looks down on her. Their eyes meet. Emma Lou's heart beats double time. She struggles for breath. "How are you feeling this evening?" he asks her quietly. I feel fine, thank you," she says. He takes a step toward her. "Don't be afraid. I never hurt girls like you." Emma Lou's eyes open wide as pure terror overtakes her body. She lets out a scream that pierces the thick summer Georgia air. Twisting her body, she turns to run away from the man, but as she does, she hears a thud and feels a sharp pain. The man has plunged a dagger deep into her back. She stumbles, falling to the hardened, packed soil. Pain surges through her body, reminding her that she is, in fact, alive, but just barely. The man takes a couple of steps in her direction, knife in hand. But, just like that, for some unknown reason, the man turns away from her and dashes back into the night, letting out a maniacal laugh as he goes. My name is B.T. Harmon, and you're listening to episode 4 of CATLICK, The Man in the Cornfield. It's July 1911. To recap, our story plays out over 56 months. July is month number 7. Months 1 through 6 saw a mysterious explosion of violence directed at poor African-American women living on the edges of the city of Atlanta. Since the beginning of the year, the city has seen at least 6 women die at the hands of an unknown assailant. 5 of those 6 were bludgeoned in the head and then had their throats cut. At the end of June, the newspapers begin to postulate that these murders were being perpetrated by one deranged individual lurking in the trees and alleyways just outside the city. On July the 2nd, the Constitution ran a front-page story about Emma Lou's encounter with the man on Hanover Street. Headline: 2 more victims of Negro fiend. Theory of Jack the Ripper given further substance. This is the first time a paper has speculated on the race of the perpetrator. They call him a Negro fiend. They gleaned this detail from the testimony of Emma Lou Sharp, who spoke with police late the night of her attack. She survived. Here is what she told police happened. After the man fled into the night, some neighbors heard her cries for help and came to her aid. As they treated Emma Lou's wounds, word of the attack began to spread through her neighborhood, and a crowd formed outside her house. Emma Lou's mother, Lena, was still missing. The Constitution explains what happened next. A party of Negro men walking in the vicinity of the Seaboard Railroad tracks near Hanover Street shortly afterwards stumbled over the prostrate form of Lena Sharp. A light revealed a huge gash in her throat, and her head lay in a pool of blood. Detectives who were immediately put to work on the case are of the opinion that the same Negro who stabbed Emma Lou Sharp killed her mother too, and also killed Addie Watts in the same section a week or so ago. The manner in which Lena Sharp was killed last night corresponds exactly with the wounds on the Watts girl's body. All these details, the description of the assailant, him asking, "How do you feel this evening?" and even the maniacal laugh as he ran back into the night, were all part of the Constitution's lengthy write-up in that morning's paper from Emma Lou's testimony. Emma Lou's testimony to police provided the first clues to the killer's physical appearance. She mentioned 4 things about him. He was tall. He had broad shoulders. He was wearing a black, wide-brimmed hat, and he was black. Now, the newspaper men had just what they needed. Not just a local boogeyman lurking in the shadows, terrifying citizens and motivating them to buy more newspapers. No, this was a black boogeyman, a double whammy. With this new information, they could construct the image of a killer, perfectly designed to terrorize the Southern mind. Someone with the cold-hearted cunning of the British Jack the Ripper, but with a distinctly Atlanta twist of it being a deranged, bloodthirsty, black Jack the Ripper. So at this point, that's what many of the papers start calling this guy. Black Jack the Ripper. Not very creative, but an easy way to remind everyone that this wasn't your average Ripper, this was a black Ripper. From this point forward, everything changes with this story. This is when the saga of the Atlanta Ripper begins to grow. At first, it gets picked up by smaller papers around the state of Georgia, but then other major metros run with the story. And finally, it hits America's biggest news market. On the morning of July the 3rd, sleepy New Yorkers opened their morning newspapers to the horrifying headline. 8 victims now of Atlanta Ripper. Mulatto women slain and mutilated on 8 consecutive Saturday nights. Negroes are in terror. Woman who escaped describes assailant as large black man neatly dressed. Now, this was from the New York Times, and they didn't exactly get all their facts straight. There had not been 8 killings like this on consecutive Saturday nights, but many of them had happened on a Saturday night. Why Saturday? Well, the Times had a theory. Killings of Negroes by Negroes are frequent enough on Saturday nights when blind tiger whiskey has been flowing freely, and if the murders had been of the ordinary kind, even a series of them would have caused little stir among the blacks. The 8 killings of the 8 past weeks, however, appear to be the work of a madman as methodical and cunning as the Jack the Ripper, whose gruesome London murders startled the world over 20 years ago. The New York Times thought it was simple. Listen, black people get really drunk on Saturday nights and they just go around killing each other. Hell, this is so common, they wouldn't have even noticed had these murders not been so gruesome. Now, I'm used to seeing racist stuff like this in the Atlanta papers, but To be honest, I was kind of shocked to see this in the New York Times. The assumption here is that black people are just naturally more violent. This article is proof that it wasn't just the South that had backwards views on race back then. It was pervasive to varying degrees across the country. And it's actually ridiculous if you think about it. Would a white male journalist in New York City have any idea whatsoever about the goings-on of the black community in Atlanta in 1911? Hell no. This little blurb is just dripping with racist assumptions. And remember, white readers were consuming this kind of stuff every single day. On the 4th of July, amidst articles about fireworks and Independence Day celebrations, the Georgian ran a headline: Negroes offer reward for woman slayer. The article declared that a Negro Jack the Ripper was operating in the city and that he, quote, employs a knife to do his execution. It then mentions a guy named L.L. Lee, a black undertaker who donated $25 of his own money to start raising a reward for the capture of the killer. Now, this would be the beginning of the African-American community taking matters into its own hands. But it was just the beginning. On July the 6th, some local black leaders planned a mass meeting at a church down in the neighborhood of Pittsburgh. The church was packed. Emotions ran hot, speeches were given, demands were made, a general sense of desperation pervaded the proceedings. When the dust settled, the local black leadership had a simple request to the Atlanta police: give us some black detectives to help catch this guy. Now, it's important to remember that every square inch of the Atlanta city government, including the police department, was white. Also, remember that the summaries of these meetings were being generated by white reporters at white newspapers. When you're researching history, this is one of those moments where I think it's fair to read between the lines a bit. When people aren't really given a voice, when they're not taken seriously by the people in power, they've got to get creative. And sometimes you've got to do a little dance with the powerful people to get their attention. That's kind of how I view this request. My interpretation of this request for black detectives: y'all don't really care that much. Y'all don't really care about these dead black women. Y'all don't really care about making this a priority. Y'all don't care. And I think the implication was, put some black guys on this case, and we'll get the job done ourselves. I'll give you one guess as to whether or not their request was granted. Around this same time, the morning newspapers broke a big Ripper story. Headline: Negro held in tower believed to be Ripper. Now, the tower mentioned here was the Fulton Tower. Fulton County is the county Atlanta is located in, and this was the big county jail. The tower was a really imposing structure designed to scare the hell out of would-be criminals. It's gone now, but you can see pictures of it in the vault. The Fulton Tower was constructed of giant gray granite slabs. Over time, green vines grew up the side. It had one tall, pointy spire that rose about 100 feet off the ground. It looked like one of those old European castles where you tortured people during the Inquisition. You did not want to get thrown in the tower in 1911. By the way, I'm bringing it up now because the tower is going to be mentioned a lot in this story. Again, the headline read, Negro held in tower believed to be Ripper. The story here is a bit complicated, but this is the summary. A black guy named Henry Williams gets busted for trying to seduce two young black girls, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. The article said he lured them into the woods where he assaulted them. Now, I'm not sure if that's a sexual assault or not. It doesn't really say. One of the girls escapes and alerts a trolley conductor, and he and another guy take off after this guy on foot. After a mile chase, they catch him. They bring in the two girls, and they both identify him as the guy that assaulted them. Apparently, he also confessed to the assaults. The Constitution notes that this man looks similar to the description given by Emmylou Sharp. It goes on to say, Williams had on the dark clothes, black hat, and had the same surly, bestial countenance, which the only victim whom Jack has not fatally wounded has described him as having. Surly, bestial countenance. That's pretty much just an early 1900s racist way of saying, this guy just looks shady. The article goes on to hypothesize that if this guy is the Ripper, it's obvious that he's become too scared to assault grown women, and thus has begun targeting younger, more defenseless black girls. Finally, the article notes that when they emptied Henry's pockets, they found $5.27, which was the money he'd stolen from one of the girls, but they also found a, quote, large number of Bible verses rudely scrawled, end quote. Kind of a weird detail. Was this it? Did police have their man? Could Atlanta's black community finally breathe easy? What do you think? On the night of July 8th, a white man named W.M. Seltzer calls into the Atlanta police headquarters. It's a Saturday night. The caller says a Negro woman had been assaulted near the corner of 4th and Jackson Streets. 4 officers jump on motorcycles and speed to the scene. When they arrive, Seltzer explains what happened. Under his employ was a 22-year-old black woman named Mary Yeldell. She was a cook for the Seltzer family. After finishing her duties on that Saturday night, she left his house, headed for home. As she's walking through the night, she hears a whistle come from the end of a long, dark alley. She pauses to investigate and takes a few steps in the direction of the whistle. One paper described what she saw next. Coming towards her was a giant Negro, very black, with a cat-like tread, who chased her. Terrified, Mary takes off screaming back to the home of her boss. In a panic, she explains what happened to her. Seltzer quickly grabs his revolver, loads it with bullets, and heads out into the night. When he gets to the alley, he can't believe what he sees. The outline of the man Mary described. He's still there, just standing quietly. Seltzer points his gun at the guy and yells at him. He's attempting a sort of citizen's arrest, but the man turns and flees into the night. Now, I don't really know what to believe about this story. It was picked up by papers across the country in places as far away as Pennsylvania, Vermont, Washington State. The psycho killer whistling at his potential victim from the end of a dark alley seems like something out of a movie, but they didn't have movies or even radio dramas back then, so take that for what it's worth. Nevertheless, it was apparent that Mary Yeldell had looked death in the face and survived. There were no other murders of black women on that Saturday night. But the calm would not last. Just a few days later, the Atlanta papers exploded with fresh Ripper news. Headline: Unknown slayer kills his 7th. Unidentified Negro woman is found in South Side with throat cut. No clue to murderer. Black Jack the Ripper, who usually works Saturday night, 2 days late. As the story goes, on that Tuesday morning, a black guy named Will Broglin was doing some work on a sewer line around a black neighborhood south of Atlanta called Summer Hill. He came across a pool of blood and evidence of a scuffle in some dirt. And he noticed a trail as if something had been dragged. He follows it and eventually discovers the brutalized body of a young black woman. Broglin freaks out and goes to his boss, who calls police. Police arrive on the scene, and here is what they find. A rock, about 2 pounds, covered in blood. A side comb lying in the grass and allegedly owned by the victim. And the body of the woman, later identified as Sadie Holly. Her head was smashed and her throat was cut. It was a near decapitation. Strangely, her shoes were missing as well. The detectives noticed a trail leading away from the body, which they believed to be the killer's tracks. They followed the tracks down into a ditch, up an embankment, and eventually into a cornfield. After that, the trail disappeared. The articles on this murder also noted that this woman, like most of the others, was a mulatto. Back then, that was the term for a mixed or light-skinned black person. This definitely seemed to be the Ripper's type. What we're still unsure of today is whether or not these women had been sexually assaulted. Sex was fairly taboo during this time, and none of the articles mentioned whether or not there were signs of sexual assault. Perhaps there was no sexual assault, or maybe there was, but the papers simply thought it was too inappropriate to mention. Now, this murder of Sadie Holly was unique in that her shoes were missing. It's unlikely she was out shoeless that night, so the police presumed the killer had taken them. It's important to note here that back in 1911, there wasn't a large body of research on the behaviors and patterns of serial killers. The term serial killer wasn't even really coined until the 1970s. Today, we have a ton of research and profiles on hundreds of serial killers, but not back then. In the research that exists today, criminologists have noted a common pattern among serial killers: the taking of something personal from each victim. Criminologists call this a trophy, and they believe these guys do this as a way of reliving the rush of the kill. It's a behavior exhibited by lots of serial killers. A serial killer in Alaska took jewelry from his victims. One in New York kept panties and bras. A killer by the name of Stanley Dean Baker kept his victim's fingers. One guy from England kept a victim's dog. And in the 1960s, there was a guy named Jerry Brudos who killed some women in Oregon. He eventually earned the nickname the Shoe Fetish Slayer because he would keep the shoes and even sometimes the feet of his victims. As far as we know, this was the first time the Atlanta Ripper claimed his own sick trophy, but it wouldn't be his last. The murder of Sadie Holly sparked a media frenzy. Ripper mania was consuming Atlanta, and the papers wasted no time in fanning the flames. Headline in the Constitution, July the 12th. Reign of crime grips Atlanta, police defied. Homes are robbed, Negro women slain, and no arrests are made. 8th victim taken by Jack the Ripper. This article talks about a broader wave of crime sweeping over Atlanta. It mentions the Ripper murders, but it also mentions gangs of thieves that were apparently operating in the city then too. From the article. The gang of sneak thieves and burglars which has thrown Atlanta's homes into consternation continues, unmolested to ravage where it wills. Their deeds grow bolder and bolder with each successful evasion from capture at the hands of police and detectives. Atlanta's sleuths have not even succeeded in making an arrest of anyone who even remotely might be suspected of having taken part in any of the crimes. The article throws a fair amount of shade at the Atlanta police for their inability to catch neither these gangs of thieves nor the Ripper. It also mentions that the black community was now panic-stricken, and its leaders were appealing city government to offer a reward for the capture of the killer. It then makes an interesting observation about how Atlanta's white citizens were processing this crime wave. The white people of the community, indignant over the robberies which have been of so frequent occurrence and aroused as well over the murders which have served to intensify the servant problem, are turning to the police, to the mayor, and to the governor. Did you catch that? White Atlanta is now pissed because, 1, they're getting robbed, and 2, the murders of black women had, quote, intensified the servant problem. Let me translate that for you. Atlanta's black citizens are the ones running the home affairs of Atlanta's white, wealthy citizens. They're cooking, cleaning, nannying. Ripper fear had gotten so bad, lots of these servant women simply quit showing up to work at these wealthy white homes. I mean, can you blame them? I can't. Can you imagine what it must have been like as a, say, 25-year-old black woman walking 2 or 3 miles home after work in the dark with no car, no streetlights, no cell phone, and a known killer on the loose? Nope. So, when the paper says that this whole Ripper incident has intensified the servant problem, what it's really saying is that white people now care because it's affecting them. Clothes aren't getting washed, food isn't getting cooked, repairs to fences aren't being made, and all that work is falling back on the shoulders of Atlanta's white women. And this was the core of this whole episode. Atlanta had a caring problem. Civic life was oriented around, designed for, and paid homage to white existence. If you were white, the city was designed to care about you, if nothing more than at a base level. And if you were black, no one really cared all that much outside the black community. No one cared if you were scared. No one cared that it took the papers and the police months to even begin addressing the fact that a psychopath was hunting black women in the streets. Black women were dying, and no one really cared all that much until it affected them. No one really cared, and it's hard to get people to care when no one else cares. Well, whether it was the sirens of the newspapermen or the advocacy of the black community's leadership, people around Atlanta slowly started caring a little. Mayor Cortland Wynn began putting pressure on the city council to offer a reward for the catch of the Atlanta Ripper. He actually went on record to say that the reward would be offered for the capture of the killer or killers, plural, This is one of the first suggestions that there might be more than one person behind these killings. Around the same time, the governor of Georgia, Hoke Smith, jumps in. He offers a $250 reward. When adjusted for time, that's a pot of about $7,000. Not huge, but not insignificant either. Now, if you listen to episode 3.5, CATLICK Found in the Vault, you know that Hoke Smith was no friend of the black community. So why did the mayor and the governor suddenly care about catching this killer? Well, it probably had to do with the letter they received from the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce. In it, the all-white Chamber of Commerce strikes a surprisingly kind tone towards the, quote, honest and hard-working colored people, end quote, of Atlanta. However, in their resolution, they also note that it is the labor of these people that, quote, contributes largely to the productive industry of the community. Again, did you catch that? The implication here is, y'all better catch this guy, or business in this city is going to come to a grinding halt. Truth be told, black hands were running Atlanta, and the Chamber of Commerce feared an economic apocalypse if those hands suddenly disappeared. Once again, Atlanta had a caring problem. Apparently, as the media ramped up their coverage of the killings, someone down at the police department must have taken notice. On July the 15th, the Georgian runs a headline, "Two Rippers Held, Police Get Busy." The police are now claiming to be holding not one Ripper, but two. The article explains that two more black men, Henry Huff and Todd Henderson, were thrown into the tower on suspicion of being the Ripper. According to police, Huff was spotted with Sadie Holly on the night she was murdered, and when they found him, he had blood on his pants and scratches on his arms. When questioned, he told police he'd just gotten into a bar fight that night. Todd Henderson, the second suspect, was hauled in from a saloon down on Decatur Street. Emmylou Sharp initially identified him as her attacker, saying that it was him, quote, to the best of my knowledge. Police also called in the clerk who was working the market that night. Lena Sharp went missing. When she saw Todd Henderson, she said she'd seen him in the area the night of the attacks. To make matters worse for Henderson, he lived in the general area of several Ripper murders. The Georgian said Henderson denied the allegations with this statement. "Gee, if I was Jack the Ripper, I sure would her begun on my wife, for she's given me lots of trouble." Now, I'm not adding the slang here. That's exactly how they quoted Henderson, taking special care to add in the dialect and misspell certain words. Southern newspapers did this a lot when quoting black people. Okay, to recap. There are now 3 different men being held at the tower on suspicion of being the Ripper. Maybe they had him. Maybe police had their man. Maybe. Surely this would bring the string of murders to an end. Maybe. Or maybe they were just desperate to lock anyone up for these murders. By mid-July, police were feeling the heat and citizens were demanding an end to the case. There's an article where the chief of police got really defensive, saying that they were basically doing everything they could to catch the guy. He explained that this wave of crime had a simple explanation. He didn't have enough officers patrolling the streets. Basically, that he was understaffed. He even referenced the British Jack the Ripper case, noting that it took one of the world's finest police forces, Scotland Yard, 2 years to catch the guy. It's true that the police had their hands full responding to Rippermania while chasing leads coming in from all over the city. I found an article about 6 black women who were out one night and were approached by a tall black man wearing a black hat. They screamed and fled and reported the incident to the police, but they never found the guy. Now, one of the strangest articles I discovered from all this hysteria came from the tiny Brunswick Daily News. Brunswick is a small town near Georgia's coast. If you were to drive there today from Atlanta, it'd take about 4 hours. That July, the local Brunswick paper ran a feature called Days Doing at the State Capitol. One of the write-ups in that section was a bit unusual. Here it is. A German astrologer and magician named Charles F. Hoffman has written a respectful letter to Sheriff Mangum of Fulton County, suggesting that if the county chose to employ him, he can discover by occult means who the Negro Jack the Ripper is. So, yeah, a German psychic in Brunswick is going to find the Ripper by occult means. This is obviously pretty weird, but it's also interesting because this wouldn't be the last time a local psychic offered to help Atlanta police. You may have heard of another infamous Atlanta crime spree referred to as the Atlanta child murders. It was a rash of murders in the late 1970s that saw more than a dozen young African-American men go missing or murdered. It had been a few years and the police were running out of leads. A 54-year-old crime-solving clairvoyant named Edith Allison appeared as a guest on the Phil Donahue Show. After the episode aired, excited Atlantans who'd been following the case of the Atlanta child murders swamped city government with phone calls, convinced that this woman could help police crack the case. Amazingly, the phone calls worked. The Atlanta police actually hired Edith. She put a pause on her book tour, flew to Atlanta. For several days, she walked murder sites with police, offering up clairvoyant visions of what the killer looked like and where they might find him. Spoiler alert, Edith never led them to the killer, and she left Atlanta just as quickly as she'd come. In 1911, Sheriff Mangum was a bit more crafty in how he handled the recommendation of the psychic German. I kind of love how the paper characterizes his response. Sheriff Mangum has written that he will be pleased to accept the astrologer's service, provided that an arrangement can be made by which the county pays nothing unless Hoffman delivers the goods. Well played, Sheriff. Well played. Though Atlanta's summer crime spree and subsequent Ripper mania was a big story in July of 1911, it was far from the biggest story the papers were covering. That honor fell upon the shoulders of Brigadier General Clement Anselm Evans, arguably the greatest celebrity in Georgia in 1911. Evans was a grizzled veteran of the Confederate Army. He led troops at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. He was shot 5 different times, but survived each bullet. It's like the Confederate gods always kept an eye on Clement Evans. In May of 1864, as the Civil War was reaching its peak, he was promoted to the uber-prestigious status of Brigadier General. In 1865, as the Confederate cause was slowly becoming a lost cause, General Evans was on the battlefield at Appomattox as one of Robert E. Lee's right-hand men. When the battle was lost, the war was lost. Lee signed an official writ of surrender before Ulysses S. Grant, and the Civil War was over. Clement Evans returned to his home state of Georgia alone. When he got back to Georgia, Evans became a Methodist minister. It may just be anecdotal, but it seems like a lot of former Confederates went into some kind of Christian service after the war. I tend to think this was their attempt at redeeming themselves or cleansing their souls in some way. For 26 years, the former Confederate general served in the Methodist Church, working at various congregations around the state. He did some good things in his civilian life, wrote a few books on the Civil War. Lots of former soldiers were writing about their experiences then. Evans considered a run for governor, but opted out at the last minute. One thing we know for certain about Clement Anselm Evans was that he was very, very popular in Georgia after his Confederate service. Remember, at the time of our story, the Civil War has been over for about 50 years, so there are lots of Confederate veterans still living in and around Atlanta. To them, Evans was a demigod, a larger-than-life character who'd valiantly led their cause in the war between the states. The American film and music industries had barely started in 1911, so war heroes were the closest thing America had to celebrities. Well, in July of 1911, Evans passes away at the age of 78. The newspapers were ready. Headline: Evans is at rest from struggles of war and peace. They published article after glowing article about the noble statesman, employing every word in the book to describe the fallen hero. Lovely, gallant, beloved, glorious, brilliant. One writer said that, quote, no one can find a flaw in his conduct. Another said he was a man who possessed a, quote, moral grandeur of character. When word spread of Evans' death, the newspapers were flooded with telegrams from influential people from all over the state. They printed them in the next day's edition. The State Railroad Commission put out a resolution honoring Evans and announcing that they were going to shut down the entire rail network during his funeral. It seemed like everyone cared about General Evans. When the funeral arrangements were revealed, the papers were manic. One noted that this would be the second biggest funeral in the state's history, second only to that of John Brown Gordon, who was, you guessed it, another Confederate general. On the day of the funeral, all of Atlanta shut down, including the city government. It was decided that his body should lie in state beneath the grand rotunda of the state capitol building. It was evident that this was going to be a funeral fit for a king, fit for someone who everyone cared about. Inside the rotunda, the general's body was laying not in a casket, but on a couch so that everyone who attended could see his entire body. He was regaled in his gray Confederate uniform, studded with every imaginable honor. His thick silver hair was brushed neatly behind his head, which rested peacefully on a satin pillow. Photos from that day show the couch flanked by a small mountain of flowers and weeping women in oversized hats. Bullet-riddled flags, preserved from the Confederate fields of battle, completed the look. The Constitution had this to say about the appearance of the general as he lied in state. There was a calmness upon his face which bespoke an eased soul, a grim resignation that showed that he who had dared the cannon's roar had not hesitated in the slightest when death called. In death, there was that simplicity of bearing which characterized him in life. An eased soul. Hundreds of fellow comrades from the CSA filled the rotunda. They, too, wore their gray uniforms, which had also been tested by battle. Aged veterans filed past his body somberly as they paid their final respects. After a while, they loaded up the body and began the funeral march through the high-rises of downtown Atlanta and towards First Methodist Church. Thousands of Atlantans packed the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Confederate flag-draped casket as it crept along its path. A massive entourage of mourners walked with the processional. It was a who's who among the city's power brokers. State officials, former governors, and other local elites led the march. Coca-Cola boss Asa Candler was there, as well as Governor Hoke Smith. Behind the lead group was a hobbled mass of Confederate veterans, most of them now in their 70s. Many bore a neatly coiffed white mustache, as was the custom of the time. Some of the men were missing arms and legs and thus relied on a cane as they walked. For those who couldn't walk, special arrangements were made. They were allowed to ride in a horse-drawn carriage, also festooned with the colors of the Confederacy. All local military were summoned for the processional as well. This included infantry, artillery, and men on horseback. Though this grand scene looked fit for a celebration, it was anything but. This was a parade of somber pageantry, dedicated to a man for whom this city deeply cared. When the processional arrived at the church, the grand ceremony began. The service opened with a singing of the hymn, How Firm a Foundation. The newspapers noted that this was a personal favorite of General Evans. Bishop Warren Candler, Asa's brother, led the funeral proceedings. He heaped high praise on the dead general, saying that he was, quote, as pure and clean as a woman or child. He later called him, quote, one of the past's strong men of true Christian faith. Another orator at the funeral reminded attendees to not only honor General Evans for his feats of courage on the battlefield, but also for what he accomplished later in life. When the funeral wrapped up, it was time to begin Evans' final march to his eternal resting place at Oakland Cemetery. The entire company of mourners filed quietly out of their oaken church pews and back out into the streets. Around 5 p.m., the slow-moving company of mourners began their approach into Oakland Cemetery, situated in a rural area on the eastern edge of the city. It was about 90 degrees and overcast that day. When the bellman at Oakland Cemetery spotted the processional on the horizon, he knew what to do. The slow, mournful toll of the cemetery's bell echoed through the countryside, eventually snaking its way into the black communities surrounding the cemetery. As the band of somber veterans approached Oakland, they surely thought of their fallen brothers also buried here. In 1864, many of them had fought as young men in the bloody Battle of Atlanta, which had taken place barely a mile from this very spot where 74,000 Union and Confederate troops waged a brutal battle. The South lost, and 7,000 Confederate soldiers were interred at Oakland Cemetery. General Evans' gravesite was chosen strategically. He would be buried in the shadow of what was the largest Confederate memorial at the time, a towering 65-foot obelisk placed in the heart of Oakland Cemetery. The mourners, still several hundred strong, packed in tight around the gaping hole dug in the earth. A battalion of National Guard dressed in blue flanked the scene. Bishop Candler gave his final eulogy. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes, earth to earth. The battalion in blue raised their guns and fired 3 shots. A pause. The funeral bell tolled once more. And then, the ceremonial firing of artillery. A reporter for the Georgian eulogized the scene. The scene was one to inspire within the hearts of the younger generation a spirit of love and admiration for the fast disappearing, gallant old soldiers of the South. When the cannon fired the last salute, the smoke curried heavenward, as incense burning on the altar of eternal life. The deafening boom of the cannon echoed and re-echoed as an anthem to the angels on high. And the Constitution chimed in as well. Finally, before the soil for which he had fought so well was thrown upon the body of General Clement A. Evans, a bugler symbolized the termination of a glorious and hard-fought career and the beginning of a period of peace and rest by blowing taps. As tears fell, shovels began heaping clods of Georgia soil on top of the flag-covered casket of General Clement Anselm Evans. And in that moment, it was very clear. Everyone cared. CATLICK is recorded in Atlanta's historic Cabbagetown neighborhood. It's written and produced by me, B.T. Harmon. Executive producer, Walnut Ridge Harmon. Original music and sound design by Duciel. Additional research provided by Jack Lindsay and Dimitri Eliadis. If you're digging this story, be sure to let us know by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It makes a big difference. And remember, you can get all the visuals that go along with this episode in the vault. Just go to catlick.com and click Vault. That's catlick.com. This is B.T. Harmon reminding you to save old buildings, build bike lanes, and vote for public transit. I'll see you in the next episode.